There's something most people don't know about Gaara, and it starts before he ever opened his eyes for the first time. Because Gaara's story doesn't begin with a battle or a rivalry or even a single spoken word. It begins with a death. His mother, Karura, died giving birth to him. And in that same moment, before he had taken a single full breath of air, the sand spirit known as Shukaku, the One-Tail, was sealed inside his tiny body. So think about that for a second. Most of us enter the world as nothing more than ourselves. Gaara entered it already carrying a monster, already carrying a loss he was too young to understand. He never met his mother. He only knew that his birth had taken her away. And that idea, that his existence caused pain, was written into him from the very beginning. Quite literally, in fact. Look closely at how his name is spelled in the original Japanese. The kanji chosen for Gaara can be read to mean something close to a self-loving carnage, or a demon that loves only itself. It's a subtle thing, easy to miss, but it was a quiet piece of foreshadowing planted by the creator, Masashi Kishimoto, right there in the boy's name. Before the audience ever saw what Gaara would become, the name already hinted at it. A lonely child, isolated, turning inward, learning to love no one but himself simply because no one else would. Now here's where it gets a little heavier. You've probably noticed the red kanji on Gaara's forehead. It's one of the most recognizable images in the entire series. That symbol is the character for love. And you might reasonably assume it's a tattoo, something given to him, some family mark, some tradition. But it isn't. Gaara carved that symbol into his own skin. He did it himself as a child, after slowly coming to the realization that no one in his life actually loved him. His father feared him. The village feared him. Even the people meant to protect him tried to end his life. So the boy took that word, love, the one thing he was starved for, and he wrote it permanently onto his own face. Not as a wound, but as a reminder that he would only ever love himself because he believed no one else ever would. It's one of the quietest and most tragic details in all of Naruto, and it's hiding in plain sight every time he appears on screen. But what's really surprising comes next, because to understand why Gaara exists at all, why Kishimoto created him, you have to understand who he was designed to reflect. Gaara wasn't invented as just another opponent for the Chunin exams. He was built, very deliberately, as a mirror to Naruto. Think about the parallels. Both boys were born with a tailed beast sealed inside them against their will. Both were feared by the villages that were supposed to raise them. Both grew up isolated, watched, whispered about, treated as something dangerous rather than someone human. On paper, their childhoods are almost identical, so Kishimoto used that symmetry to ask a single, haunting question. What makes the difference between these two? And the answer is bonds, connection, kindness. Naruto, for all his loneliness, eventually found people who saw him. Iruka, Kakashi, his teammates. Someone, somewhere, chose to care about him. Gaara had none of that. So Gaara became the answer to a chilling thought experiment. He shows us exactly what Naruto could have become if not a single person had ever reached out to him. The same pain, the same beast, the same rejection, but without even one kind bond to hold on to. That's why Gaara is so unsettling in his early appearances. He isn't just a villain, he's a warning. He's Naruto's shadow, walking a path that Naruto only narrowly avoided. And because those two boys were built as reflections of one another, their eventual meeting was never really about who was stronger. When they finally clash during the invasion of the Hidden Leaf, Naruto isn't just fighting Gaara, he's arguing with a version of himself. He's insisting that loneliness doesn't have to be the end of the story. Gaara believes his pain makes him invincible, that loving only himself is the only way to feel real. And Naruto, having lived that same pain, is the only person alive who can truly understand it. and the only one who can prove him wrong. That's why their confrontation carries so much weight. It became the emotional spine of the entire Chunin exams arc, the point where all those quiet parallels finally collide. So the next time you see that red symbol on his forehead, or hear his name spoken so plainly, remember what's underneath it. A child born into loss, a name that predicted his loneliness, a word for love carved by his own hand, and a character designed from the ground up to show us the fragile difference between a boy who was saved and a boy who very nearly wasn't. Because in the end, Gaara was never just a monster. He was the question the whole story was quietly asking. What very few people realize is that Shukaku, the one-tail, was never designed to be a simple monster at all. Masashi Kishimoto built the beast on the foundation of the tanuki, the raccoon dog of Japanese folklore, and that choice carries centuries of meaning. In old stories, tanuki are shapeshifters and tricksters, playful spirits who blur the line between harmless mischief and something genuinely unsettling. So when you look at Shukaku, you're not looking at a random sand demon. You're looking at a creature deliberately pulled from a tradition of deceivers, beings who wear a friendly face while hiding something wild underneath. That single design decision explains almost everything strange about the way Shukaku behaves. Because a trickster spirit doesn't simply attack, it waits. It watches for the moment your guard drops. And in Gaara's case, that moment was sleep. This is the detail that so many people miss on a first viewing. Shukaku suffered from insomnia, and that insomnia was passed directly into the boy who carried it. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a mechanic of the seal itself. The moment Gaara closed his eyes and let his mind go quiet, the beast could rise and take control of his body. Therefore, Gaara did the only thing a terrified child could do. He stopped sleeping. Night after night, year after year, he stayed awake, not because he wasn't tired, but because rest itself had become the enemy. Think about the quiet horror of that for a moment. Most children fear the dark because of what might be hiding in it. Gaara feared the dark because of what was hiding in him. He couldn't run from the monster because the monster shared his skin. So the very thing that heals most people, the simple act of falling asleep, was the one thing he could never safely allow. That's the psychology Kishimoto was reaching for. The dark circles around Gaara's eyes were never just a stylistic flourish. They were the visual proof of a boy who had not truly rested in years, drawn deliberately to make you feel the exhaustion before you ever understood the reason for it. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating, because Shukaku's influence didn't stop at robbing Gaara of sleep. It shaped the way he fought, right down to the smallest visual habit. You may have noticed that Gaara never touches his weapon directly. He carries a gourd of sand on his back, but he almost never reaches into it with intent. Instead, the sand moves on its own. It rises to block an attack before Gaara even seems aware of the danger. That automatic defense has a source, and the source is Shukaku. The one-tail's mastery over sand and wind bled into its host, giving Gaara what fans came to call the ultimate defense, a shield that reacts faster than thought because it isn't fully under his conscious control. So his signature move wasn't a technique he trained for years to perfect. It was, in part, a gift and a curse handed down from the beast inside him. That connection between host and spirit runs deeper than most people expect. The sand didn't only protect Gaara's body, it protected the fragile boundary between him and the creature he was terrified of becoming. Every grain that rose to defend him was, in a strange way, a reminder that Shukaku was always awake, always present, always ready. Which makes what happens later in the story so surprising. Here is the truly counterintuitive part, the detail that turns everything you'd expect on its head. Shukaku begins as pure torment, the voice in the dark, the reason a child couldn't sleep. You would assume a character built from that much pain would stay menacing forever. But in the later arcs, Kishimoto did something almost no one saw coming. He rewrote Shukaku as comic relief. The beast that once whispered madness into a lonely boy becomes loud, boastful, argumentative, almost absurd. It bickers, it complains. It behaves less like a demon and more like a grumpy, oversized house cat with an ego. So the same creature that defined the horror of Gaara's childhood eventually becomes a grudging ally, softening from tormentor into something closer to a difficult friend. That shift wasn't an accident. It mirrors Gaara's own journey. As Gaara learns to trust, to protect, to lead, the monster inside him is allowed to change too. The Tanuki roots come full circle here, because Tanuki and folklore were never purely evil. They were mischievous, unpredictable, sometimes even lucky charms. So Shukaku ending the story as a cranky, comedic presence isn't a betrayal of the character. It's a return to the folklore it came from all along. The trickster stops tricking and simply becomes itself. And so, the beast that started as a curse ends as a companion. The insomnia, the sand, the fear, the loneliness, all of it was written to be endured and, eventually, outgrown. Shukaku was never just the thing that haunted Gaara. It was the part of him waiting to be understood. The monster and the boy grew up together, quietly, over the length of a very long story, until neither one was quite what they had been at the beginning. The story of Rasa begins with a number, and it isn't a flattering one. Of the 4 people who have held the title of Kazekage across the recorded history of the Hidden Sand, Rasa is the only one confirmed to have sealed a tailed beast into his own child. Others in the ninja world made similar choices, of course. Villages have a long habit of turning children into weapons. But within Sunagakure itself, this was a first, and it would remain a defining mark against his name long after he was gone. He was the 4th Kazekage, and by most measures he was a capable leader. The Sand was a poor village. It sat in a harsh desert. It received fewer missions than its rivals, and its funding had been quietly cut by the very nation it served. So Rasa did what a desperate leader does. He looked for an advantage, and he decided the advantage would be the one-tailed beast, Shukaku. He chose his newborn son as the vessel. That son was Gaara. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people. Shukaku had been sealed into hosts before, in earlier generations, and those bonds had never held for long. Gaara was, in a sense, the version that finally held. His mother, Karura, did not survive his birth, and in the folklore of the Sand, her resentment was said to live on inside the sand that protected him. Whether or not that was ever true, Rasa allowed the story to spread, because a weapon feared by its own village is still a weapon. But a weapon that cannot be controlled is a liability. And this is where Rasa's calculation began to unravel. Gaara's power grew unstable. The sand moved on its own. It killed without instruction. And Rasa, having created the problem, decided the cleanest solution was to end it. Over the course of Gaara's early childhood, Rasa is said to have ordered assassination attempts against his own son on multiple occasions. Think about that quietly for a moment. The man who had gambled everything on this child was now spending resources trying to kill him. The most trusted of those sent was Yashamaru, Gaara's uncle, his mother's brother, the one person who fed him and bandaged his wounds and told him that people could be loved. Yashamaru was ordered to make the final attempt, and when it failed, he told Gaara the truth as a last cruelty, that no one had ever loved him, that even the kindness had been an assignment. That single night is the pivot on which Gaara's entire life turns. It is the reason he stopped trusting affection, carved the symbol for love into his own forehead, and chose to live only for himself. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come, and it has to do with how Rasa fought. Because for all his failures as a father, Rasa was genuinely one of the strongest Kazekage the sand ever produced. And the reason is a detail that even many casual fans overlook. Rasa did not rely on ordinary sand. He wielded gold dust, a rare ability passed down in his bloodline, treated in the series as a Kekkei Genkai. And here is the counterintuitive part. Gold dust is heavier and denser than the sand Gaara commands. In their world, weight is leverage. When Gaara's sand met Rasa's gold, the gold could press it down, pin it, and overpower it. In other words, the father was built, almost by design, to defeat the son. The one man in the desert whose technique could reliably beat Gaara's was the man who made him. That fact carries a strange weight when you consider what happens later. Rasa died before the main events of the story, assassinated and replaced in a plot involving the sand's enemies. He never reconciled with Gaara in life. He never saw his son grow. So the account of him should have ended there, unfinished. Another parent who failed and then simply stopped existing. But the story gives him one more scene, and it is the quietest tragedy in his whole record. During the Fourth Shinobi World War, Rasa is reanimated, pulled back from death against his will, and forced to fight. On the battlefield, he sees Gaara again, and he learns something he never knew while living. His son had not become the monster he feared. Gaara had become the fifth Kazekage. The boy Rasa tried to kill now held the exact title Rasa himself had held, and held it better, because Gaara led with the very thing his father had thrown away. And so Rasa, standing there as a corpse animated by another man's jutsu, finally says it. He admits that he had loved his son all along, that the assassinations and the cruelty had been rooted in a father's fear rather than hatred, and that Karura's love had always been in the sand, shielding Gaara, never trying to harm him. It is an apology arriving years too late, delivered by a man who is already dead, on a battlefield neither of them chose. A confession with no future attached to it. Just the truth, spoken once, into the desert wind. Behind the familiar appearance of Yashamaru, there is a truth that quietly reverses everything we assume about kindness in this story. Because when we picture the one person who cared for a lonely child, we imagine safety. We imagine the exception to the cruelty. Yashamaru was Gaara's uncle, the younger brother of Gaara's late mother, and for the earliest years of the boy's life, he was exactly that exception. He tended Gaara's wounds. He sat with him. He answered the endless, childish questions that a small boy asks when he is trying to understand a world that keeps flinching away from him. Gaara would ask what pain felt like, and Yashamaru would explain it patiently, without cruelty, without fear. In a village that treated the child as a weapon first and a person never, Yashamaru seemed to be the single soft place left. But here is where the conventional picture begins to crack. We tend to assume that betrayal comes from strangers, from enemies, from the people already standing at a distance. The gentler assumption is that love, once given, protects you. Gaara's life was built to prove the opposite. Because Yashamaru was not simply a caretaker acting on his own kindness. He was a shinobi of the sand, bound by orders, and those orders came from the very top. Rasa, the fourth Kazekage, Gaara's own father, had decided that the boy had become too dangerous, too unstable, too great a risk to the village he was created to protect. So the assassination was arranged, and the person chosen to carry it out was not an outsider. It was the one man Gaara trusted completely. Think about the logic of that choice for a moment. If you wanted to test whether a Jinchuriki's defenses could be broken, you would not send someone he feared. You would send someone he loved, because love lowers the guard that fear keeps raised. Therefore, Yashamaru attacked. The uncle who had bandaged the boy's cuts now moved to end his life, and Gaara's automatic sand defense, the shield he could not consciously control, rose to protect him even from the person he least expected to need protection from. But here's what almost nobody knows about that final exchange. When the attack failed and Yashamaru lay dying, he had one last chance to speak, and he did not spend it on regret. Gaara, still a small child, still trying to make the pieces fit, needed to understand why. And Yashamaru told him that he had never truly loved him. He said that caring for the boy had been nothing more than duty, that his heart had never been in it, that Gaara had imagined a warmth that was never really there. Now, the counterintuitive part is this. We assume a dying man's final words are the most honest words he will ever say. We treat last words as pure truth. But Yashamaru's last words were almost certainly a lie, a deliberate one. He appears to have believed that if Gaara could stop hoping for love, if he could sever that attachment cleanly, the boy would be freed from the pain of wanting it. It was meant as a mercy, a gift disguised as cruelty, offered by a man who had just tried to kill him. But mercy and damage can wear the same face, and the lie did not free Gaara. It broke him. Because he had already lost his mother in childbirth, already been isolated by his village, and now the last person who seemed to care was telling him that the caring itself had never existed. So the logical conclusion, for a child with no one left, was devastatingly simple. If no one in the world would love him, then he would have to become the source of that love himself. And this is the exact scene where Gaara carves the kanji for love into his own forehead. Not as decoration, and not as a threat, but as a vow. A permanent mark chosen because self-love was the only love that remained available to him. He would love only himself, and he would exist only for himself, and the desert would take everything else. But there is one more detail, and it is the one that turns the whole tragedy quietly inside out. When Masashi Kishimoto designed Yashamaru, many viewers have long noticed a striking resemblance to Karura, Gaara's mother. The soft features, the light hair, the gentle expression. As her brother, of course, he would carry a family likeness. And whether or not it was fully deliberate, the effect is the same. The last comfort in Gaara's childhood seemed to wear the face of the family that childhood had already taken from him. The boy who never met his mother was being cared for by the closest living echo of her, and that same echo was the one sent to end him. So the conventional wisdom says that love is what keeps a child safe. Gaara's story says something colder and stranger. That love, in his life, was the shape the danger chose to take, because it was the only shape that could get close enough. The one face he trusted was the face he was always going to lose. And when it was gone, all that was left was a symbol pressed into his own skin and the quiet of the sand. If you look closely at Temari, you'll notice something that's easy to miss the first time through the story. Because while Gaara's life reads like a tragedy about a boy nobody could love, the person standing closest to him for all those years wasn't a protector at all. It was his older sister, and she was afraid of him. That's the part people tend to forget. Temari is the eldest of the 3 sand siblings, older than both Kankuro and Gaara, but seniority didn't make her the guardian of the family. It made her a witness. She grew up watching what the village watched, a small boy who couldn't control the things sealed inside him, a boy whose affection could turn deadly without warning. So for years, her instinct around her own little brother wasn't to shield him. It was to keep her distance, the same as everyone else in the hidden sand. That distance shaped who she became. Temari trained as a wind release specialist, and her weapon of choice tells you a lot about her. She fights with a giant folding fan, an enormous iron war fan that she opens in stages, each purple moon marking another level of power. When all 3 moons show, she swings it at full force, and the blast of wind can flatten a forest. It's a style built for the desert. She works with the open air and the moving sand around her, turning the very environment of her homeland into a weapon. She isn't the strongest of the siblings in raw terror, but she's arguably the most disciplined, the most precise, the one who thinks 2 moves ahead. But here's where the story takes its first real turn. Because after Gaara's redemption, after he loses, after he's shown a different way to live, after he chooses to protect instead of destroy, everything about Temari's relationship to him changes. The fear doesn't just fade, it flips. It becomes loyalty. When Gaara rises to become the 5th Kazekage, the leader of the entire village that once feared him, it's Temari and Kankuro standing at his side as his most trusted defenders. The sister who once flinched at his shadow becomes one of the people willing to die for him. That's the quiet miracle at the center of the Sand siblings, a family that had every reason to break apart and instead pulled itself back together. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because Temari's story doesn't stay in the desert. This is where the lucky twist comes in, the kind of accident of fate that ends up changing 3 generations. During the Chunin exams, and then again during the invasion and the missions that follow, Temari keeps crossing paths with a lazy strategist from the Hidden Leaf named Shikamaru Nara. On paper, they're opposites. She's sharp, direct, from a village of sun and sand. He's slouched, unbothered, always calling everything too troublesome. They even fought each other once, in a match Shikamaru famously chose to forfeit, not because he'd lost, but because he'd run out of chakra after outthinking her the entire time. You'd think nothing would come of 2 people who spend most of their scenes bickering, but that friction is exactly what pulls them together. Over the years, as the sand and the leaf grow closer as allies, Temari and Shikamaru keep being paired up on diplomatic work. She becomes the sand's liaison to Konoha, and he's the one assigned to escort her. Slowly, without either of them announcing it, that rivalry turns into partnership, and the partnership turns into something more. By the end of the story, Temari does something no one watching the early episodes would have predicted. She marries into the leaf. She marries Shikamaru Nara, and she leaves the desert behind to build a home in the Hidden Leaf village. Now think about what that quietly means. Gaara, the boy who carried a monster, the child the whole village kept at arm's length. His own bloodline ends up woven directly into one of Konoha's oldest and most respected families, the Nara clan. His sister's children carry that lineage forward. Temari and Shikamaru have a son, Shikadai, who grows up in the next generation, in the Boruto era. Shikadai inherits the Nara clan's shadow techniques from his father, and that same sharp, no-nonsense edge from his mother. So the story of 3 orphaned siblings in a desert village doesn't just end with them surviving. It reaches all the way into the future, into a new generation of ninja who don't even remember how fragile it all once was. That's the part worth sitting with. A small choice, a forfeited match, a series of escort missions. 2 stubborn people who kept getting assigned to each other became the thread that tied the sand and the leaf together by blood. The sister who was once afraid of her brother became a bridge between 2 nations. And Gaara, who spent his childhood believing he'd always be alone, ended up with a family line that outlived his loneliness entirely, carried quietly forward by the sister who once kept her distance, and now never would again. People rarely talk about Deidara as the man who started Gaara's whole story in Shippuden, but that's exactly what he was. When the second era of the series opens, the very first crisis isn't a war or a betrayal. It's a kidnapping. And the person carrying it out is a blonde, laughing artist from the Hidden Stone Village, gliding over the desert on a bird made of clay. Deidara wasn't there by accident. The Akatsuki had assigned him to capture the One-Tail, and the One-Tail lived inside Gaara. So the boy who spent his childhood feared as a monster became, years later, the first target in a hunt for the very thing that made him feared. Deidara's method tells you a lot about him. He didn't storm the village gates. He molded explosive clay into birds and set them loose over the sand, forcing Gaara to rise up and defend his home from the air. That's where the fight happened. High above the desert, sand against clay, two artists of destruction testing each other. And here's the detail that so often gets skipped. Gaara actually won that exchange in a meaningful way. His sand crushed one of Deidara's arms clean off. Deidara only succeeded because Gaara spent the last of his strength shielding the village below from a falling bomb, choosing the people who once rejected him over his own safety. That lost arm mattered more than it looks. Deidara was a proud man, obsessed with his art, and losing a limb to Gaara wounded that pride deeply. The boy from the sand left a mark on Deidara, a humiliation that stayed with the proud artist long after the desert fight had ended. In other words, Gaara's defiance carved something into Deidara that the boy from the sand himself never fully saw. But what's really surprising comes next, because the capture didn't just weaken Gaara, it killed him. The Akatsuki's extraction process pulls a tailed beast out of its host, and for the host, that process is fatal. When Shukaku was drawn out of Gaara, Gaara died. Not symbolically, not nearly, but genuinely. He is one of the very few main characters in the entire series to actually die on screen, his body left cold while his sister Temari and the rescue teams arrived too late to stop it. For a story that often finds ways around death, this was the real thing. So the question became how someone truly dead could return, and the answer connects to a character most people forget: Chiyo. Chiyo was an elder of the Sand Village, a puppet master whose history reached back generations. She had once sealed Shukaku into Gaara in the first place, when he was still an infant. She carried guilt for the life that decision gave him, and she knew a forbidden technique, a reincarnation jutsu designed to transfer the user's own life force into another body. It was never meant to be used lightly, because it demanded everything from the person who cast it. So Chiyo made a choice. She knelt beside Gaara's body and poured her own life into his, with Naruto adding his chakra to help the technique take hold. This is the part that reframes the whole rescue. Gaara wasn't saved by medicine, or by a hidden healing power, or by some last-second trick of the plot. He was saved because an old woman decided her long life was worth less than his short one. Chiyo died so that Gaara could breathe again, closing a circle that started decades earlier when she sealed the beast inside him. She gave the monster to the child, and in the end, she gave the child back his life. And then comes the image that ties it all together. Gaara wakes surrounded by people, dozens of them, the shinobi of his own village, who had traveled out into the desert not to contain him, but to bring him home. As he sits up, confused and quiet, the entire crowd sinks to their knees around him. This is the same village that once whispered that he was cursed, the same streets where parents pulled their children away, the same people who spent his childhood treating him as something to be survived rather than loved. Now they knelt, not out of fear, but out of relief that their Kazekage had returned. So the thread runs further than it first appears. Deidara's mission set everything in motion, and it also cost him an arm to the boy from the sand. Gaara's death forced Chiyo to spend her final act undoing the very seal she'd created. And the village that rejected him became the village that mourned him and celebrated his return in the same breath. What looked like a simple kidnapping at the start of Shippuden was really a knot connecting the Stone Village's proud artist, the sand village's oldest secrets, and a boy who once believed he'd always be alone, now surrounded, quietly, by everyone who finally chose to stay. Curiously enough, Naruto is the reason Gaara's story bends away from tragedy at all. When these two boys first meet during the Chunin exams, they are almost mirror images of each other. Both carried a tailed beast sealed inside them before they could even speak. Both grew up watching adults flinch away from them. Both spent their earliest years learning that the word monster was the first thing most people saw. The difference, and it turns out to be the whole difference, is that Naruto slowly gathered people who chose to stay, while Gaara concluded that the only way to prove his own existence was to erase everyone else's. So when they finally clash in the invasion of Konoha, the fight isn't really about power. Gaara is, by raw ability, arguably the stronger of the two at that moment. His sand defends him automatically, without effort, without thought. Naruto has no comparable shield. What he has instead is a stubborn refusal to accept that loneliness has to be permanent. And that's the tension of the scene. Two people carrying the exact same wound, and only one of them still believes the wound can heal. The resolution is what makes the moment land. Their battle doesn't end with a killing blow. It ends with Naruto, exhausted and barely able to move, admitting that he understands Gaara's loneliness completely because he has lived inside it too. That single admission disarms Gaara more thoroughly than any jutsu could. He had spent his life certain that no one could possibly understand what it felt like to be him. Being wrong about that, being seen, is the thing that finally cracks the shell open. And because of that one meeting, Gaara makes a quiet decision that reshapes his entire future. He chooses to protect his village instead of destroying it. That's an enormous reversal when you remember that this is the same village that feared him, isolated him, and, as we learn later, actively tried to have him killed while he was still a child. He had every reason to walk away from the sand entirely. Instead, he decides that the loneliness he suffered should be the reason no one else has to suffer it. He turns his pain into a purpose rather than a weapon. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. That decision doesn't just change Gaara personally. It launches him upward through the ranks of his own village with startling speed. By the time Shippuden begins, Gaara has become the 5th Kazekage, the leader of the entire Hidden Sand Village, while still a teenager. Think about the sheer strangeness of that. This is a village that once dispatched assassins to murder him in his sleep, now placing its highest office in his hands. The boy they treated as a failed experiment becomes the person they trust to defend all of them. That makes Gaara one of the youngest Kage in the history of the ninja world. And here's the detail that quietly overturns the usual assumption about him. People remember Gaara as the terrifying figure from the Chunin exams, the one who crushed opponents with sand and smiled while doing it. But by his late teens, he is respected less for his violence and more for his restraint, his judgment, and his willingness to put himself last. The frightening child becomes the steady adult in the room. It's one of the most complete character reversals in the entire story, and it happens without erasing who he was. He doesn't forget the loneliness. He simply learns to carry it differently. His growth is tested almost immediately and painfully. Early in Shippuden, Gaara is captured by the Akatsuki, who extract the one-tailed beast from his body to fuel their larger plan. The extraction kills him, and the reaction of his village tells you everything about how far he has come. The same sand village that once wanted him dead now mourns him openly, and an elder gives her own life to bring him back. The child no one wanted becomes the leader no one is willing to lose. That contrast, drawn so deliberately, is the emotional core of his arc. So by the time the ninja world faces its greatest crisis, the Fourth Great Ninja War, Gaara has become something the story has been building toward all along. When the five great nations gather, suspicious of one another, weighed down by centuries of grudges and old wars, it is Gaara who stands and delivers the speech that unites them. And the argument he uses is not strategy or fear. It's his own history. He tells them, in effect, that he was once a Jinchuriki, consumed by hatred, that he was saved by someone reaching out to him, and that this is exactly what the Alliance must do for the world. He turns his old wound into the very thing that binds thousands of former enemies together. It's a fitting endpoint for a boy who once believed he'd always be alone. The loneliness that nearly destroyed him becomes the reason he can speak to everyone else's isolation and dissolve it. His pain, refined over years, ends up being the thread that ties the whole shinobi world into something like unity. Originally, Gaara wasn't meant to be saved at all. When Masashi Kishimoto first sketched him into the story, he imagined him as something closer to a pure antagonist, a walking warning rather than a person. The idea was simple, almost mathematical. Naruto was a boy who had every reason to become a monster, yet somehow found people who loved him. So Kishimoto asked himself a quiet, uncomfortable question. What would that same boy look like if no one ever had? Gaara was the answer. He was designed to be the mirror, the reflection of the road Naruto never walked down. That mirror idea shaped everything about him. Like Naruto, Gaara carries a tailed beast sealed inside his body, a living weight pressing against him from the moment he was born. But where Naruto slowly gathered bonds, teammates, mentors, a village that eventually came to see him, Gaara found only fear. The same circumstances, the same burden, and yet two completely different outcomes. One boy was taught he mattered. The other was taught he was dangerous, and he believed it, because everyone around him seemed to agree. That was the whole point of him. He existed to show what love, or the absence of it, could do to a single child. Even his name was built to unsettle you before he ever moved. Kishimoto chose characters for it that carry the meaning of a self-loving carnage, a demon who loves only himself. It was a deliberate choice, engineered so that the sound of his name would sit wrong in your ear, so that you'd feel a small chill before you ever saw him fight. Everything about his introduction was tuned toward dread. The pale skin, the dark rings around sleepless eyes, the gourd of sand on his back, the flat, empty voice. He was assembled, piece by piece, to be someone you were supposed to be afraid of, and then quietly relieved to see defeated. But here is where the story slips out of its creator's hands, and this is the part that makes Gaara so fascinating. Because the audience refused to read him the way he was written. In Japan, Shonen Jump ran regular character popularity polls, letting readers vote for their favorites, and Gaara, this villain, this cautionary tale, kept climbing them. He didn't just do well. He consistently placed among the very top characters in the entire series, sometimes hovering right alongside the heroes he was created to threaten, occasionally even above them. A boy meant to be feared had become a boy people adored. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Kishimoto noticed. He saw the numbers, he read the reception, and he made a decision that quietly changed the shape of the whole manga. Instead of using Gaara as intended, defeating him, closing the chapter, and moving on to the next threat, he leaned the other way. He chose to redeem him. The character built to be discarded after the Chunin exams was, because of that overwhelming response, kept alive and slowly turned toward the light. In a very real sense, the readers rewrote his fate. Their votes became the thread that pulled him back from the version of himself he was supposed to embody. And so the transformation that followed feels almost like a happy accident, a mistake in the original blueprint that turned out better than the plan. The boy designed as a warning became one of the most beloved redemption arcs in the entire story. He doesn't vanish. He grows. He learns, painfully and slowly, that the loneliness he carried was never proof that he was worthless. Naruto, of all people, reaches him, because Naruto recognizes himself in that emptiness. Two mirrors, finally facing each other, and one of them says out loud what the other never got to hear. You are not alone. That's the moment the antagonist quietly stops being an antagonist. What makes this so satisfying is how neatly it inverts the intention. Gaara was meant to prove a dark point, that without love, a child becomes a weapon. But by surviving long enough to be loved by an audience, he ended up proving the opposite, that even the version of Naruto who lost everything could still find his way back. The cautionary tale became the comeback story. The mirror meant to reflect the worst possible outcome, instead reflected hope. And it happened not entirely by design, but because thousands of readers looked at a character they were told to fear and decided, quietly and collectively, that they cared about him instead. You can trace almost his entire future to that one turning point. His rise to become the Kazekage, the leader of his own village. The trust he eventually earns from the very people who once flinched at his name. His central role in uniting the shinobi world when it needs unity most. All of it grows out of a decision to keep a character who was only ever supposed to be a lesson. It's one of the clearest examples in the series of a story listening to the people reading it and being made better for it. A monster who was meant to be defeated, kept alive by affection, and reshaped into someone worth loving. One often overlooked detail about Kankuro is that his entire design carries a piece of Japanese theater history hidden in plain sight. The purple markings on his face look, at first glance, like the kind of stylized decoration anime characters wear for no particular reason. But Kishimoto didn't pull those lines from imagination. He based them on the makeup of kabuki, the centuries-old form of Japanese stage drama where actors paint their faces in bold, exaggerated patterns to signal a character's nature at a single glance. In kabuki, that painted style is called kumadori, and every color and curve means something. Red lines suggest passion, heroism, or righteous strength. Blue or purple lines tend to mark villainy, arrogance, or something darker beneath the surface. So when you look at Kankuro's face, you're not looking at random flair. You're looking at a deliberate borrowing from a theatrical tradition that's older than almost any anime convention, quietly telling you this is a performer, a manipulator, someone who works from behind a mask. And that reference runs deeper than the paint, because Kankuro is a puppeteer. Kabuki itself grew up alongside another classical Japanese art form called bunraku, the theater of large, elaborate puppets operated by hidden masters. In bunraku, a single puppet can require multiple handlers working in perfect coordination, controlling every finger and every tilt of the head. So, a face-painted character who fights by controlling puppets isn't a coincidence at all. He's a small tribute to two intertwined pillars of Japanese performance, folded into a ninja. That puppetry also ties directly into the wider lore of his village. The Hidden Sand is famous, more than any other village, for the puppet arts as a form of combat. It's their specialty, their signature discipline. So Kankuro isn't just a quirky fighter with a strange toolkit. He's a product of Suna's oldest martial tradition, carrying forward a craft the desert village is genuinely known for. His puppets, with their concealed blades and poison mechanisms, are the practical, deadly evolution of that same hidden master idea from the stage. But here's what almost nobody knows about how far that influence reaches. The names of Kankuro's puppets themselves are drawn from Japanese theater and folklore. Karasu, his first puppet, simply means crow. Kurowari means black ant. Sanshowo, the heavily armored one, means salamander. And salamander connects back once again to old theatrical and mythological imagery. the creature long associated with resilience and with surviving fire. So even the objects he carries into battle are named with the same careful cultural grammar as the paint on his face. Nothing about him is accidental. He is, from head to toe, a walking reference to the performing arts of Japan. Now set all of that against who Kankuro actually is as a person, because the contrast is where his story becomes quietly moving. He is Gaara's older brother, and for most of their childhood, he was terrified of him. Not annoyed, not distant in the ordinary way of siblings, but genuinely afraid, keeping the same careful space from Gaara that everyone else in Suna kept. The boy who wore the mask of a confident showman spent his early years flinching at his own younger brother's name. That fear makes what comes later so striking. Because Kankuro doesn't stay afraid. As Gaara changes, as the monster the village feared is slowly reshaped into a leader worth following, Kankuro changes with him. He becomes one of Gaara's most devoted protectors, so the relationship inverts completely. The brother who once kept his distance becomes the one who stands closest, and he proves it with his life. When the Akatsuki come for Gaara, it's Kankuro who chases after Sasori, a legendary puppet master, and, fittingly, a former son of the sand himself. Kankuro pursues him alone, knowing the danger, to defend the village his brother now leads. He's poisoned and nearly killed in that fight. So the man who was once too frightened to stand near Gaara ends up nearly dying in the desert trying to save him. The fear didn't just fade. It was replaced by loyalty so complete he was willing to trade his life for it. There's a quiet symmetry in that Sasori confrontation too. Two puppeteers of the sand, facing each other across a generation. One who abandoned the village, and one who would die protecting it. The art form that defines Kankuro becomes the very stage on which his devotion is tested. And here's the small, gentle twist that the whole arc builds toward. In the later years, when Gaara has become Kazekage, it's Kankuro who watches over him. He stands guard over his brother's safety and, in his own way, over his rest. The sibling who once couldn't sleep easy near Gaara becomes the one who makes sure Gaara can. The fear traveled a full circle and came out the other side as protection. So beneath the kabuki paint and the theater-named puppets and the old cultural echoes stitched into his design, Kankuro's real story is that simplest and hardest of human turns. A boy who was afraid, who learned to stay, and who chose, quietly and completely, to guard the very person he once feared. Here's something genuinely fascinating about Baki. He's one of those characters whose most interesting story might be the one that never quite got told. On the page, Baki is the Jonin sensei assigned to the Sand siblings, which means Gaara technically trained under him long before he ever wore the title of Kazekage. Think about that for a moment. Before Gaara was a leader, before he was even trusted, he was a student, and the man standing over that lonely, dangerous boy was Baki. But here's where it gets strange, because that teacher-student bond is one the story barely lets us see. We're told it exists. We're rarely shown it forming, and that absence is the interesting part. In most stories, a sensei is the emotional anchor for the young ninja under his care. Kakashi shapes Naruto. Guy shapes Lee. But Gaara's early years were defined by isolation, by a village that feared him and a father who tried to have him killed. So when you look at Baki, you find a mentor who was present but powerless, assigned to guide a child that Suna itself had already decided was a weapon rather than a person. The version of Baki who could have been Gaara's saving figure simply never materialized. Instead, he became something quieter, a supervising officer to 3 children the village didn't know how to love. Then comes the invasion of Konoha, and here Baki's role turns genuinely dark. He was deeply complicit in it. Following Suna's alliance with Orochimaru, he helped coordinate the attack on the Leaf, working alongside a man who had already murdered the real Kazekage and taken his place. So Baki wasn't a bystander. He was a participant in one of the most treacherous moments in the series, a senior jonin carrying out orders that would have seen Konoha burn. And that makes what happens afterward almost hard to reconcile. Because after the invasion collapses, after Orochimaru's betrayal is exposed and Suna is left humiliated and weakened, Baki doesn't vanish. He doesn't get purged. Instead, when Gaara eventually rises to become the 5th Kazekage, Baki stays on as a trusted senior advisor. The man who once helped endanger the surrounding world becomes a steadying hand beside the young leader rebuilding it. It's a redemption the story treats almost casually, as if the alternate, harsher version, the one where Baki answers for his part in the invasion, was simply written out. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because if you look at how Baki actually fights, you find a technique that ties him directly to the identity of Gaara's entire home. His signature move is the Wind Blade, sometimes translated as the Blade of Wind, an invisible cutting current of air so sharp it can sever flesh without ever being seen. It's a quiet, understated technique, and it fits Suna perfectly. This is a village built on wind-heavy chakra, a place where the desert air itself carries force. So Baki isn't just a soldier of the sand. He embodies its elemental nature, the same wind that swirls around Gaara's sand, the same invisible pressure that defines the land Gaara grew up defending. But here's the contradiction worth sitting with. Baki represents the old Suna, the corrupt one. He's a product of the era that broke Gaara, the era that made a child into a weapon, that allied with a monster to attack a neighbor, that valued strength over the people it was meant to protect. That version of Suna is the one that nearly destroyed Gaara from the inside. So logically, Baki should belong to the past, a relic of a system that failed. And yet the story does something subtler. It keeps him. It keeps him precisely because he's a bridge. Baki quietly connects two eras that should never have been able to coexist. There's the old, corrupt Suna, the one that produced the invasion, the one that treated its own Jinchuriki as a tool to be discarded. And there's the reformed Suna, the one that finally chose to trust Gaara, to follow him, to let a boy who was once feared become the very heart of the village. Baki stands with one foot in each. He was there for the mistakes, and he's there for the healing. He watched the system fail, and then he helped the same system learn to believe in the person it had wronged. That's the alternate version of Baki that lingers underneath the one we get, the deeper teacher, the one whose arc from complicity to loyalty could have been an entire story of its own. Instead, the manga leaves it understated, almost unspoken, a redemption you have to assemble yourself from scattered pieces. And maybe that restraint is fitting. Baki was never meant to be the emotional center. He was meant to be the constant in the background, the wind you don't see until it moves something. So when Gaara finally takes his place as Kazekage, surrounded by the village that once rejected him, Baki is simply there, standing where he's always stood, a survivor of the old world, quietly helping to hold up the new one. There's something most people don't know about Chiyo. She wasn't just an elder of the Sand Village, some quiet advisor tucked away in the background of Gaara's story. She was the one who started it all. Long before Gaara was ever born, before he had a name or a face, Chiyo was the sealing master chosen to bind the one-tailed beast, Shukaku, into a human host. And the host she chose was Gaara, still unborn, still inside his mother's womb. That's the detail that changes everything. When you understand that, Gaara's entire childhood stops being a tragedy that simply happened to him and becomes something that was done to him, deliberately, by the leadership of his own village. Chiyo held the knowledge of that ancient sealing technique, so when the fourth Kazekage wanted a weapon for the sand, she was the one with the hands to make it. The isolation, the fear, the sleepless nights, the boy no one would touch, all of it traces back to a single decision she made before Gaara ever drew breath. But here's what makes her character so unusual. She didn't walk away from that decision untouched. Chiyo carried the weight of it for decades. She knew what she had done. She had watched the child she helped create grow into something monstrous and alone, and she lived long enough to see the full cost of it. Most stories would leave a character like that as a villain, or forget her entirely. Kishimoto did something quieter and stranger. He kept her alive, kept her aware, and let that guilt sit inside her for years. And this is where her story connects to another one, because Chiyo's grief wasn't only about Gaara. She had a grandson. His name was Sasori. Sasori of the Red Sand, one of the most gifted puppet masters the village ever produced, and a member of the Akatsuki. Chiyo had helped raise him after his parents died, and she had lost him too, watched him abandon the sand, turn his own body into a puppet, and disappear into a criminal organization. So by the time the story reaches her, Chiyo is a woman who has already failed to save the two people closest to her legacy, one she cursed, and one she couldn't hold on to. But what's really surprising comes next. When the Akatsuki finally capture Gaara and extract Shukaku from his body, Gaara dies. The beast that Chiyo sealed into him is torn out, and the process kills him, exactly the way it was always going to. And in that moment, the old woman who put the monster inside him in the first place makes her final choice. She kneels beside his body and performs a forbidden technique, a life transfer jutsu, one that returns a person to life by giving up the caster's own. Think about the shape of that. Chiyo knew this jutsu for years. She could have used it on anyone. She could have saved it, hoarded it, kept it for someone she loved. Instead, she chose to spend her entire remaining life to bring back the very boy whose life she had ruined. The woman who took Gaara's normal childhood from him is the one who ultimately gives it back, in the most literal way possible, by trading her breath for his. And it isn't a coincidence that she does this right after fighting Sasori. In her final battle, Chiyo faces her own grandson, and she cannot save him. He dies as his true self, a puppet with a living heart, and she can only watch. So when she turns to Gaara moments later, you're seeing the same impulse redirected. She couldn't restore the grandson she loved. Therefore, she pours everything she has left into saving the boy she once wronged. One life she failed to protect, and one life she chooses to redeem. It's the same act of love, just aimed at the person she still has a chance to reach. That's the mirror Kishimoto built into her arc, and it's a deliberate one. Sasori and Gaara are placed side by side on purpose, two products of the sand, two people shaped by loss, and Chiyo standing between them as the one who couldn't save the first, but refuses to fail the second. Her death isn't random. It's the closing of a circle she opened decades earlier, when she first sealed a beast into an unborn child. And there's a quiet symmetry in how it lands. Because when Chiyo brings Gaara back, it's not only her power that revives him. Naruto is there, lending his own energy to the technique, and the villagers of the sand gather around, mourning a leader they had once feared. So the sealing that isolated Gaara ends with a resurrection that reconnects him, surrounded by the very people who once kept their distance. The monster she put inside him separated him from the world. Her final jutsu returns him to it. That's the strange completeness of Chiyo's story. She is both the origin of Gaara's suffering and the source of his second chance, the hand that cursed him and the hand that healed him. And she does it knowingly, with full understanding of everything she owed him, quietly settling a debt she had carried, alone, for most of her long life. What very few people realize is that Sasori was never meant to be a distant villain, some outsider drifting in from the edges of the map to threaten a boy he had no connection to. Sasori came from the hidden sand, the very same village that raised Gaara, the very same village that named Gaara its Kazekage. And that single detail quietly reshapes the entire arc. The organization hunting Gaara does not arrive as strangers. It arrives, in part, as one of Suna's own, a rogue son of the desert returning to help tear the tailed beast out of the leader his village had finally learned to trust. Think about what that means for a moment. The kidnapping is not just an attack on a Jinchuriki. It is personal, woven into the history of a single place. A man born in Suna, trained in Suna, shaped by Suna's own puppet traditions, becomes part of the plot to strip Suna of its Kazekage. The threat comes from inside the family, and that is precisely why it lands so heavily. Now, in the actual capture, it is Deidara who flies in and takes Gaara. Deidara with his clay birds and his explosions. But Sasori's roots are the quieter reason the operation works at all. Because Sasori knew Suna. He knew its defenses, its layout, the rhythms of a village he had once called home. So when the Akatsuki moved against the sand, they were not guessing. They were acting on the knowledge of someone who had lived there, which is exactly why the assault felt so surgical, so impossibly well-informed. And here is the detail that quietly turns the whole thing on its head. Sasori, this master of puppets, did not simply build puppets. He turned himself into one. Over the years, he converted his own body into a living puppet, preserving only a small core of his heart to keep himself alive, hollowing out his humanity in exchange for a body that would never age and never die. A man who abandoned everything that made him human plays a central role in the very arc about Gaara reclaiming his own. That contrast is the heart of it. Gaara's entire journey is about learning to feel again, learning to connect, learning that the monster inside him does not have to define him. And standing across from that story is Sasori, who chose the opposite path, who looked at his own pain and decided the answer was to stop being human altogether. Two people from the same desert, facing the loss of everything they loved, walking in exactly opposite directions. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. Because the person who finally stops Sasori is not some rival ninja from a foreign land. It is Chiyo, his own grandmother, an elder of the sand who had watched Sasori grow up, who had trained him in the puppet arts, who had carried the weight of his abandonment for years. And she does not fight alone. She fights alongside Sakura, a young medic from the Leaf, the two of them combining old wisdom and new strength against a man who thought he had made himself untouchable. There is a quiet cruelty in how that battle is designed. Sasori's greatest creations, the puppets he treasured most, are the puppets Chiyo turns against him, because she was the one who taught him how they worked in the first place. His art is used to unmake him. And in the middle of that fight, Sasori reveals the puppet bodies of his own parents, figures he built after losing them as a child. A glimpse of the grief that started him down this road. For just a moment, the invincible puppet master is simply a boy who lost his family and never learned how to grieve. So his defeat and Gaara's rescue become the same story, braided together into a single thread. The fall of the man who helped threaten Gaara happens at the hands of Gaara's own village, carried out by the grandmother of the villain and the healer from the leaf. One battle closes the door on Sasori's long, hollow existence, while the other opens the door for Gaara to come back to life. And what makes it linger is the symmetry. Both Sasori and Gaara were shaped by loss inside the same walls of sand. Both were handed pain far too early. But where Sasori answered that pain by carving out his heart, Gaara is given the chance to keep his, protected by the very people who once feared him. Sasori becomes the warning of what Gaara could have been, the shadow of a life lived entirely inside the armor. In the end, Sasori chooses stillness. He lowers his guard, lets his grandmother's blades find the one living part of him he had left, and allows himself, finally, to rest. It is a quiet ending for a man who spent his whole life trying to escape endings altogether. And it leaves Gaara's story free to move forward, no longer defined by the monster he carried, no longer bound to the desert's oldest sorrows, but stepping gently into a second life that Sasori never let himself imagine. The story of Bunpuku begins in a place most tellings of Gaara's life never bothered to visit, which is the past. Long before the sand ever wrapped itself around a lonely child in the hidden sand village, long before Shukaku became a weapon passed from hand to hand, there was a monk. His name was Bunpuku, and according to the lore, he holds a quiet record that almost no one remembers. He was Shukaku's very first Jinchuriki, the very first human ever chosen to carry the one-tailed beast inside his own body. Now, think about what that means for a moment. When we meet Gaara, he seems like the beginning of something. A boy born with a monster stitched into him, treated as if he were the first and only person cursed in this way. But that isn't true. Gaara was never the first. He was the latest in a hidden lineage, a long chain of hosts stretching back across generations, and Bunpuku sits right at the front of it. Every Jinchuriki who ever held Shukaku traces back to this one monk. So Gaara's suffering, which felt so singular and so personal, was actually part of a much older pattern that the village had simply chosen to forget. And here is where the record becomes something stranger than a simple date in history. Because you would expect the very first person to hold a tailed beast to have the worst possible experience. No one before him had done it. There were no lessons, no seals perfected over time, no elders who understood what it felt like. Bunpuku was walking into the dark completely alone, so the tension is obvious. If anyone had reason to be destroyed by Shukaku, to be driven mad the way Gaara nearly was, it should have been the first man to ever try. But the resolution flips that expectation entirely. Bunpuku didn't break. He didn't become a mindless vessel screaming against the thing inside him. Instead, he did something that no one in Gaara's generation seemed to believe was even possible. He formed a genuine friendship with Shukaku, a real bond, monk and beast, built on patience rather than chains. And that single fact quietly rewrites everything we thought we knew about the one-tailed creature. Shukaku was never doomed to be a monster. It was capable of trust. It was capable of connection. It simply needed someone willing to offer it. Yet the most unexpected part is still to come. Because if the first Jinchuriki could befriend Shukaku, then a very uncomfortable question rises to the surface. Why did it go so wrong for Gaara? Why did the boy become cruel, isolated, convinced that the only way to exist was to hurt others before they could hurt him? For years, the easy answer was the beast. People assumed Gaara was violent because of what he carried, that the monster inside simply corrupted him from the inside out. But Bunpuku proves that answer false. The same beast, in gentler hands, became a companion. So the cruelty was never inevitable. It was never written into what Gaara carried. which means the failure belonged somewhere else. It belonged to the village. Gaara wasn't broken by Shukaku. He was broken by the way the hidden sand treated him, by the assassins sent after a small child, by a father who saw a tool instead of a son, by a community that decided he was a weapon before he was ever a person. Bunpuku's story reframes Gaara's early years completely. The monster was never the villain of his childhood. The people around him were. And that is a heavier truth than any beast could ever be. But the lineage leaves one more thread, and it's perhaps the most touching detail of all. Because bonds like the one Bunpuku formed don't simply vanish when a host dies. Shukaku remembered. Across all those generations, through every Jinchuriki who came and went, the beast held on to the memory of the one monk who treated it with kindness instead of fear. And that memory matters, because it helps explain something that puzzles a lot of people who watch Gaara's story unfold. In the later arcs, Shukaku softens. The creature that once raged and hungered begins to show something closer to respect, even loyalty. That change doesn't come from nowhere. It comes in part from Bunpuku, from a friendship planted so long ago that its roots reach all the way to the present. So the obscure record turns out to be the key to everything. The first Jinchuriki of Shukaku wasn't just a footnote, a name to fill out a timeline. He was proof that the beast could love, proof that Gaara's pain was a failure of people rather than a curse of fate, and proof that kindness offered once can echo across generations, waiting patiently for someone else to receive it. Bunpuku never met Gaara. They were separated by more years than either of them could count. And yet, in the quietest way imaginable, the monk who came first helped make it possible for the boy who came last to finally be understood, and finally, gently, to be forgiven. Behind the familiar appearance of Sasuke Uchiha, there is a truth that quietly reverses everything you might expect about him. And it becomes clearest when you set him beside Gaara. Because on the surface, these two seem like different problems entirely. One is the last proud son of a fallen clan. The other is a weaponized child who was never wanted. But look a little closer, and you'll find that the writers built them as mirrors, two reflections of the same wound, held up to face each other so the audience could watch what happens when the same pain is answered in two opposite ways. They first truly collide during the Chunin exams, in the preliminary rounds and the build-up to the finals. And this is the moment that mattered, because Sasuke, fresh from his intense training with Kakashi, comes into that arena carrying the Chidori, a technique meant to pierce anything in a single focused strike. Gaara, by contrast, had never in his life been touched. His sand moved on its own to protect him, an automatic shield that no opponent had ever broken. So when Sasuke's attack drove through that barrier and actually drew Gaara's blood, the crowd inside the story gasped, and the audience watching at home did too. For the first time, someone had cracked the wall around Gaara, and both boys' fans erupted, because it felt like watching an impossible thing finally give way. But here is the counterintuitive part, and it's the reason the fight lingers in people's memory. That breakthrough did not belong to Sasuke. The clash was cut short. The invasion of the Leaf Village began mid-battle. The arena dissolved into chaos, and Sasuke's duel with Gaara never reached its ending. So the person who was set up as Gaara's rival, the prodigy with the piercing technique, is not the one who reaches him at all. That role passes instead to Naruto, the boy nobody expected, the one who chased Gaara through a forest after Sasuke had already reached his limit. And it's Naruto, not Sasuke, who finally speaks to the loneliness inside Gaara and cracks something far deeper than a shield of sand. That switch is not an accident of plot. It's the entire point the story is making. Because both of these boys were shaped by loss. Both were prodigies. Both were isolated, treated as something other than a normal child. But their pain pointed them in different directions. Sasuke's whole existence had been bent toward revenge, toward the brother who destroyed his family, and everything in him was organized around that single purpose. Gaara, on the other hand, was not chasing revenge. He was chasing proof that he existed at all, proof that his life had meaning, expressed through the only thing that ever made him feel real, which was the pain he could inflict on others. Two lonely children then, but one wants to destroy a person, and the other simply wants to matter. And here's what almost nobody notices on a first watch. The moment that saves Gaara is not a stronger technique or a cleverer strategy. It's a connection. Naruto reaches him by admitting that he understands the loneliness, that he was heading toward the same darkness, and that the only thing that pulled him out was the bonds he formed with people who acknowledged him. That single conversation begins to turn Gaara around. So the monster of the sand, the child everyone feared, starts walking a path back toward the world. Later he becomes the Kazekage, the leader of his own village, trusted with the safety of the very people who once feared him. He heals, in other words, by letting others in. But Sasuke does the opposite, and this is where the mirror does its quiet, painful work. Offered the same lesson, the same bonds, the same hand held out by Naruto, Sasuke refuses it. He decides that attachment is weakness, that severing his bonds will make him strong enough to finish his revenge. So while Gaara moves toward people, Sasuke moves away from them. He leaves the village. He chases power through Orochimaru. He spirals further and further into isolation, choosing again and again the very darkness that Gaara was pulled out of. The two boys start from an almost identical wound, and then walk in exactly opposite directions, which flips the usual expectation entirely. If you had watched that Chunin exams fight and been asked which of these two would find peace, most people would have chosen Sasuke without hesitation. He was the celebrated genius, the fan favorite, the one with the loving village behind him. Gaara was the outcast, the killer, the boy defined by a demon. And yet Gaara is the one who ends up walking the redemption road that Sasuke keeps rejecting, healing the same injury that Sasuke lets fester for years. So, in the end, these two rivals become a study in a single idea, the same wound healed two different ways. One boy accepts connection and slowly becomes whole. The other refuses it and nearly loses himself completely. And the quiet lesson underneath it all is that strength was never the thing that decided their fates. It was whether they were willing to be reached. If you look closely at Matsuri, you'll notice that she almost shouldn't exist as a shinobi at all. She's a shy, soft-spoken girl from Sunagakure, the kind of person who seems to shrink into the background of a room. And on the surface, that alone wouldn't be strange. Plenty of quiet people become skilled ninja. But Matsuri carries a fear that runs against everything her chosen path is supposed to demand. She is terrified of weapons. Not nervous around them, not merely cautious, genuinely, deeply afraid of blades. And when you sit with that for a moment, it starts to feel like a contradiction. Because a shinobi is, in the simplest terms, someone who fights. A ninja who fears the very tools of their trade seems like a story destined to end before it begins. So you'd expect her to fail. You'd expect her to be quietly moved aside, told this life isn't for her. But instead, something unlikely happens. She becomes Gaara's very first student, the boy who once existed only to kill, the one whose name was spoken in fear, takes on a frightened girl as his very first pupil. And rather than forcing a sword into her trembling hands, he does something almost no one would have predicted from him. He pays attention to what she is afraid of, and he works around it. Gaara chooses to teach her the Joyo, a rope dart. It's a flexible weapon, a length of cord with a weighted point at the end, something you swing and control at a distance rather than grip up close. And the reasoning behind that choice is quietly remarkable. A rope dart lets her fight without ever having to close her hand around a cold steel blade. It removes the exact thing that paralyzes her. This is a boy who, not long before, was known for nothing but destruction. And here he is, thinking carefully about how to reach a scared child without ever asking her to become someone she isn't. And that detail matters more when you remember where Gaara came from. For most of his childhood, he was the one everyone avoided. The villagers of Sunagakure feared him, kept their distance, treated him like something dangerous that had wandered into their streets. He grew up learning that the world would rather step away from him than step toward him. So when a timid girl willingly seeks him out, chooses him, of all people, as the person she wants to learn from, it becomes a gentle reversal of his entire early life. The one everyone ran from is now the one someone runs toward. And behind all of this hides something even more interesting. Because Matsuri isn't just an unusual student. She's an unusual character in a much larger sense. She doesn't appear anywhere in Masashi Kishimoto's original manga, not a single panel. She was created entirely for the anime, written into a filler arc that exists outside the main story Kishimoto himself drew. And that changes how you read her. She wasn't part of the grand plan. She was, in a way, a happy accident. A character invented not to advance some sweeping plot, but to open a small window into a side of Gaara that the main story rarely had time to show. Think about what that means. The manga gives us Gaara the weapon, Gaara the Jinchuriki, Gaara the boy who has to be redeemed and reborn as a leader. But it doesn't have much room to show us Gaara the teacher, the patient, observant mentor who notices a child's fear and quietly builds a lesson around it. That version of him only really surfaces because someone decided to write a story that didn't strictly need to exist. And so Matsuri becomes the vehicle for it. Her entire reason for being is to let us watch Gaara be gentle. Without her, that softness might have stayed hidden, implied, but never quite shown. So the accident becomes the point. A character who was never in the source material ends up carrying one of the warmest ideas connected to Gaara's arc. And it goes a little further than that. Matsuri's devotion to him runs so deep that many viewers read her as harboring genuine feelings for Gaara, an admiration that clearly reaches past simple gratitude. And there's something fitting about that. The boy who spent his youth being looked at with terror finally has someone who looks at him with the opposite expression. Where the whole village once saw a monster, this one girl sees a mentor worth adoring. And that's the quiet symmetry hiding in all of it. Matsuri fears weapons, so Gaara gives her one she doesn't have to fear. The world once feared Gaara, and now a fearful girl chooses to stand beside him without flinching. She was never meant to be in the story, yet she ends up revealing the part of him the story most needed us to see. A shy character, born from a side project, quietly reshaping how we understand a boy who was once defined only by how much people wanted to stay away. Sometimes the smallest, most accidental additions are the ones that show us who a person was really becoming all along. And so we close the sand-swept path we've wandered tonight, from the boy who carried a monster to the quiet bond he found with Matsuri. Thank you for drifting through this journey with me. Sleep is already reaching for you now. Let these stories settle over you like desert dust in moonlight. Sweet dreams.